They mocked the quiet woman in first class, assuming she didn't belong among military officers. But when a 4-star general saw her hidden tattoo, everything changed. Her invisible service had saved lives they'd never know about. Like if you believe true heroes don't always wear uniforms. Subscribe for more incredible stories. And comment where you're watching from. The Reagan National Airport gate buzzed with the familiar chaos of military personnel boarding Flight 447 to San Diego. First class filled quickly with uniforms. Dress blues, service khakis, the occasional flight suit. Emily Hartwell stood in line, clutching her boarding pass with fingers that trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. Her civilian clothes, worn jeans, a faded cardigan buttoned to her throat, scuffed leather boots, marked her as different, the other passengers noticed. They always did. Colonel Colin Mercer turned from his seat in 2A, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. This is some kind of joke, right? Who authorized a civilian in military priority seating? Emily's breath caught. She kept her eyes forward, fingers tightening on her small carry-on. Inside, old tools clinked softly against each other. Precision instruments from another life, another identity she'd been forced to abandon. Must be a charity upgrade. Colonel Dale Rutledge laughed from across the aisle. Probably thought it was some kind of raffle. The flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced nervously between Emily and the officers. Other passengers turned to stare. Emily felt their judgment like heat on her skin. Mercer's gaze swept over her appearance with obvious disdain. "Check her card, I'm betting fraud." Emily's hand instinctively moved to her throat, ensuring her cardigan remained closed, beneath the fabric. Just below her collarbone lay a secret that could change everything. If anyone bothered to look beyond her humble exterior, the airplane's cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as more eyes turned her way. Captain Rachel Dunning, her uniform crisp and medals gleaming, spoke loud enough for the entire section to hear. She doesn't even know what military priority means. Clearly doesn't belong here. Emily's military training, dormant but never forgotten, kept her spine straight despite the humiliation. She observed the exits automatically, noted the overhead compartment latches, maintained her bearing even as her cheeks burned with shame. Mercer pulled out his phone, angling it toward her. "Security needs to know about this. Fraud in a military zone is federal." The threat hung in the recycled air. Emily closed her eyes briefly, remembering other threats, other accusations, other moments when her service had been questioned or forgotten. She'd spent years in hangars that didn't officially exist, working on aircraft that weren't supposed to fly, solving problems that kept people alive. None of that mattered now. To these people, she was just a woman in the wrong place. The flight attendant approached hesitantly. "Ma'am, if there's been some mistake with your seating." "There's no mistake," Emily said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. "This is my seat." But as laughter rippled through first class and cameras pointed in her direction, Emily wondered if standing her ground was worth the cost. The weight of hidden history pressed against her ribs, secrets that couldn't be spoken aloud, sacrifices that would never be acknowledged. The boarding door remained open, more passengers filing in. But Emily felt trapped in this moment of judgment. She'd survived classified missions and equipment failures that should have killed her. She'd saved lives and operations worth billions. Yet here she sat, invisible and mocked, her true identity locked away beneath civilian clothes and a carefully buttoned cardigan. The airplane's interior felt stifling as Emily moved down the narrow aisle, her small bag heavy with tools that clinked softly with each step. Other passengers had already claimed their territories, spreading belongings across seats with the confidence of belonging. She found her seat, 2C, and began the careful process of stowing her bag in the overhead compartment. As she lifted it, the worn leather flap opened slightly, revealing a glimpse of her past. Precision measurement tools, their metal surfaces dulled by years of use, and something else that caught the light briefly. A challenge coin, brass worn smooth by countless hands bearing a symbol most people would never recognize. Emily quickly closed the bag and secured it overhead, but not before her fingers brushed the coin's familiar edges. The flight attendant, Sarah according to her name tag, noticed her gentle handling of the bag. "Traveling light." "I try to," Emily replied, settling into her seat. "I just need to get to San Diego." Her posture straightened automatically as she buckled her seatbelt, shoulders back, spine aligned, a muscle memory from decades of service. She checked the safety card not for information but from habit, her eyes tracking exit rows and flotation devices with the same precision she'd once used to assess aircraft systems. From 2 rows ahead, Mercer's voice carried easily over the engine noise. Funny how she acts like military but dresses like a lost civilian. Something's not right. Emily carefully arranged her few belongings. A worn paperback, reading glasses with a slight bend in the frame, a small pouch containing her most essential tools. Each movement was economical, purposeful, lacking the nervous energy of an uncertain traveler. The challenge coin pressed against her leg through her pocket, its weight both comforting and dangerous. VX-47 Delta. Even thinking the designation sent a familiar chill through her chest. Most people who'd heard those numbers were dead or sworn to secrecy. She was one of the few who remained in the gray area between. "Ma'am?" Sarah appeared beside her seat again. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Emily shook her head, then reconsidered. "Actually, could you tell me what time we're expected to land? I have someone meeting me." It was a lie. No one would be waiting for her in San Diego, but it sounded normal, civilian, unthreatening. Mercer twisted in his seat, clearly eavesdropping. His eyes narrowed as he studied her profile, searching for something to justify his suspicion. Emily kept her cardigan buttoned high despite the cabin's growing warmth, protecting the secret that rested just below her throat. The coin in her pocket seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, a reminder of missions that never happened, of aircraft that didn't exist in any official records, of nights spent solving problems that kept the country safe while remaining invisible to history. She'd earned her place on this flight in ways these officers would never understand. But explaining would require revelations that could destroy lives, including her own. So she sat quietly, enduring their judgment, protecting secrets that had cost her everything. The cabin temperature rose as they waited for clearance to taxi. Emily watched other passengers remove jackets and loosen collars while she kept her cardigan fastened. Even as sweat began to gather at the base of her neck, Mercer stood partially in the aisle, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Look, just admit you used someone else's military credentials. I can shut this down before it becomes a formal complaint." "The seat is mine," Emily repeated, her voice low but firm. Murmurs spread through first class like ripples. Other officers craned their necks to see the confrontation, their expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. Captain Dunning leaned forward from her seat. "She doesn't even know what Bravo-level priority means. This is clearly above her pay grade." Emily's fingers found the challenge coin through the fabric of her pocket. Bravo level. She'd held clearances they couldn't imagine, worked in facilities that existed in the shadows between official and deniable. But those credentials had died with her official career. "We could call airport security," Mercer threatened, his phone already in his hand. "Military impersonation in a federal zone is serious." The walls of the cabin seemed to close in. Emily felt the familiar sensation of being trapped, not by the physical space but by circumstances beyond her control. She'd experienced this before, in debriefing rooms where her reports were questioned, in medical evaluations where her fitness for duty was debated, in retirement meetings where her contributions were minimized for security reasons. Near the back of first class, a quiet man in his 60s watched the confrontation with growing interest. Howard Lake had spent his career on airstrips that didn't appear on maps, servicing aircraft during missions he was never supposed to remember. Something about the woman's bearing, the way she held herself despite the humiliation, triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. The flight attendant appeared again, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. "Sir, if we could all just remain seated while we prepare for departure." "She's the problem," Mercer insisted. "Check her documentation again. I guarantee there's fraud involved." Emily closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of judgment from a dozen military professionals who saw only what she appeared to be. The irony cut deep. She'd spent her career being invisible, working in the shadows to keep others safe. Now that invisibility had become a liability. The airplane's air circulation system hummed steadily, but the atmosphere grew thicker with each passing moment. Emily tugged at her cardigan's top button, the fabric suddenly feeling restrictive against her throat. Howard Lake shifted in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests. Something about this situation felt wrong. Not the woman's presence, but the reaction to it. In his experience, the people who deserve the most respect often look like they deserve the least. The heat continued to build, and Emily's breathing became slightly labored. She needed air, needed space, needed to escape the suffocating judgment surrounding her. But escape would mean abandoning the seat she'd earned through sacrifice. These people would never understand. The delay stretched longer as ground control held them at the gate. The cabin's environmental system struggled with the packed aircraft, and Emily felt perspiration gathering beneath her carefully buttoned cardigan. Other passengers had long since removed their outer layers, but she maintained her protective barrier. Howard Lake's eyes never left her. Something nagged at his memory. A fragment of conversation from years ago. A half-remembered briefing about specialists who worked in the deep black programs. The woman's posture reminded him of the tech specialists he'd encountered on remote airstrips. People who fixed problems that couldn't be acknowledged officially. The heat became unbearable. Emily's fingers moved to her cardigan's top button. Hesitating, she'd kept this secret hidden for so long that exposure felt like surrender, but the suffocating air left her little choice. She opened the button, then the second, allowing her cardigan to fall slightly open at the throat just below her collarbone. Partially revealed by the loosened fabric, 3 lines of text in precise military stenciling. X-47 Delta. Mercer's eyes locked onto the marking immediately. His expression shifted from irritation to triumph. There it is. Fake military tattoo. A civilian copying classified codes is a federal crime. He raised his phone, snapping photos while other passengers leaned in to see. Emily instinctively pulled her cardigan closed, but the damage was done. VX-47, Mercer announced loudly. Probably copied it from some movie. This is pathetic. But across the aisle, Howard Lake's face had gone pale. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his seat. VX-47 Delta. He'd heard those numbers before. Whispered in hangars where aircraft that didn't exist were maintained by people who officially weren't there. Ma'am, the flight attendant approached nervously. There seems to be some concern about your documentation. Lake found his voice quiet but firm. We need to verify this through proper channels. This is serious. Mercer looked pleased. Exactly, military fraud. No, Lake interrupted. Serious in ways you don't understand. Emily met Lake's eyes across the aisle. In them, she saw something she hadn't experienced in years. Recognition, not of her face, but of what she represented. Lake leaned toward the flight attendant. Contact your supervisor. Tell them we need a discreet military verification. This shouldn't be handled at passenger level. The flight attendant nodded and moved toward the front of the aircraft. Emily remained motionless, her cardigan clutched closed, while around her the investigation that would change everything began to unfold. In the distance, she could hear radio chatter as ground control coordinated with someone off the aircraft. Her heart hammered against her ribs, though whether from fear or hope she couldn't say. The aircraft's intercom crackled softly as the flight attendant returned from the cockpit, her expression carefully neutral. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay while we coordinate with ground personnel. We appreciate your patience. Mercer crossed his arms, satisfaction radiating from his posture. I told you. Fraud investigation. She'll be off this aircraft in 10 minutes. Emily remained motionless, her breathing controlled despite the chaos around her. She'd learned long ago that panic served no purpose. In crisis situations, survival depended on steady nerves and clear thinking. The radio chatter from the cockpit became more frequent. Through the partially open door, she could hear fragments of conversation. Verification required. Elevated clearance needed. Senior officer incoming. Howard Lake watched the proceedings with growing certainty. VX-47 Delta wasn't a designation someone copied from fiction. It was part of a program so classified that most people who knew about it were either dead or bound by oaths that superseded normal military hierarchy. Whatever's happening, Lake said quietly to the passenger beside him. This isn't standard fraud investigation. The aircraft's exterior door opened with a mechanical whir. Footsteps echoed in the jetway, measured, purposeful, carrying the weight of absolute authority. The sound was different from the hurried steps of airport personnel or the casual gait of delayed passengers. These were military boots, worn by someone accustomed to command. Emily's pulse quickened. Part of her hoped for vindication, while another part feared exposure of secrets that could destroy what remained of her life. The VX-47 program had ended for good reasons. Reasons that included people dying when its existence was revealed. The flight attendant stationed herself near the door, her posture suddenly more formal. Through the small window, Emily could see ground personnel stepping aside with obvious deference. Someone very important was boarding their aircraft. Mercer adjusted his uniform, clearly anticipating an opportunity to present his case to a superior officer. Rutledge straightened his tie. Captain Dunning checked her appearance in her phone's camera. Emily simply waited, her hands folded in her lap, the challenge coin pressing against her leg through her pocket. Whatever happened next would determine whether her past remained buried or finally received the acknowledgement it deserved. The footsteps grew closer, and the atmosphere in first class shifted from mockery to anticipation. Howard Lake leaned forward slightly, his experienced eye focused on the doorway. Everyone waited to see who would step through that door and decide Emily Hartwell's fate. The figure that appeared in the aircraft doorway commanded immediate attention without saying a word. General Franklin O'Neill moved with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to having his presence reshape rooms. His dress uniform was understated but immaculate. Ribbons and medals arranged with mathematical precision. He was older than Emily remembered. Silver hair where there had once been brown. Lines around his eyes that spoke of years carrying classified burdens. But his bearing remained unchanged. Calm, authoritative, and absolutely uncompromising when duty called. The general's gaze swept the first-class cabin, cataloging faces with the automatic assessment of a career military officer. His eyes paused on the uniformed personnel, Mercer, Rutledge, Dunning, acknowledging their presence with subtle nods. Then his gaze found Emily. The change in his expression was instantaneous and unmistakable. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. His composed features shifted through surprise, concern, and something deeper, something that looked like long-carried guilt. The cabin fell silent as O'Neill walked directly to Emily's row. Every eye in first class tracked his movement, confusion evident on faces that had expected him to address Mercer's accusations. Instead, General O'Neill stopped beside Seat 2C and came to attention. He rendered a full military salute. "Ms. Hartwell." His voice carried the weight of formal respect, pitched so the entire cabin could hear. "I didn't expect to encounter you again. The Air Force still owes you a considerable debt." The silence that followed was absolute. Emily looked up at him, seeing past the years and the rank to the younger officer she'd once worked with in hangars that didn't exist. The man whose career had advanced partly because she'd solved problems that kept missions from becoming disasters. "General O'Neill," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. He relaxed his posture but maintained his formal bearing. From his briefcase, he withdrew a slim folder marked with classification stamps. Inside, Emily caught a glimpse of the VX-47 Delta symbol, the same marking that had triggered this entire confrontation. "For those who might have questions," O'Neill said, his words carrying across the stunned cabin. Ms. Hartwell's technical diagnostics prevented catastrophic failure during Operation Sentinel East. Without her expertise, several aircraft and their crews would not have returned from classified missions. Colonel Mercer's face had drained of color. Captain Dunning sat frozen, her accusatory words hanging in the air like smoke. "The work she performed," O'Neill continued, "saved lives and preserved billions in critical assets. Her contributions remain classified, but her valor has never been in question." The validation Emily had carried in her heart for years was finally being spoken aloud, witnessed by the same people who had mocked her minutes earlier. During the atmosphere in first class shifted like weather changing before a storm. Colonel Mercer's confident posture crumbled as he processed the general's words. His hands fumbled with his phone, still displaying the photo he'd taken of Emily's tattoo as evidence of fraud. "General," Mercer began, his voice lacking its earlier authority, "we had insufficient information to properly assess." O'Neill's gaze cut through the excuse without mercy. "Then you should have demonstrated sufficient respect instead of making assumptions." The general's words carried the weight of absolute authority, but his tone remained conversational, which somehow made them more devastating than any shouted reprimand. Colonel Rutledge, who had laughed about charity upgrades, now stared at his hands. Captain Dunning's earlier certainty about military protocols evaporated as she realized she'd challenged someone whose clearances had exceeded her own. "Heroes," O'Neill continued, his words meant for everyone present, don't always look like what we expect them to look like. A passenger in the back began clapping slowly. The sound built gradually as others joined, until most of first class was applauding, not the polite acknowledgement typical of commercial flights, but genuine appreciation tinged with embarrassment over what they'd witnessed. Emily remained seated, accepting the recognition with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. She didn't gloat or glare at her accusers. She simply existed in this moment of vindication, feeling pieces of herself that had been broken slowly beginning to heal. Howard Lake smiled from his seat, satisfied that his instincts about the woman had been correct. He'd spent enough time around special operations personnel to recognize competence disguised as humility. The flight attendant approached O'Neill with professional deference. "General, how would you like us to proceed?" "Ms. Hartwell will travel under full military priority status," he said, his voice carrying enough authority to reshape reality. "Please ensure this is noted in all flight records." He then did something that surprised everyone, including Emily. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a small presentation box and placed it gently in her hands. Inside lay a medal Emily had never seen before, a technical achievement decoration that existed outside normal military hierarchies. It was recognition for work that couldn't be officially acknowledged, crafted for people whose contributions lived in classified shadows. "This should have been presented years ago," O'Neill said quietly. The delay was administrative, not intentional. The applause grew stronger, passengers standing to get a better view of the ceremony unfolding in their midst. Even some who had initially sided with Mercer found themselves clapping, caught up in a moment that transcended their earlier judgments. For the first time in years, Emily felt the weight of invisible service finally acknowledged. San Diego's Lindbergh Field appeared through the aircraft windows as they began their descent, the setting sun painting the Pacific in shades of gold and amber that reminded Emily of the countless sunsets she'd watched from classified airstrips around the world. The familiar coastline approached with a sense of homecoming she hadn't expected. This wasn't her destination so much as her return to a community that had finally remembered her existence. The airplane's descent felt different somehow, less like an ending and more like a beginning. Emily held the small metal box in her lap, occasionally opening it to study the unfamiliar decoration inside. The metal caught the cabin's overhead lighting, casting tiny reflections that danced across her fingers, like the instrument panel lights she'd spent years monitoring during late-night diagnostic sessions. General O'Neill had spent most of the flight sharing carefully chosen stories about how her technical innovations had influenced aircraft development in ways she'd never known. Each revelation felt like discovering that seeds she'd planted in secret gardens had grown into forests that sheltered people she'd never met. "The hydraulic line configuration you recommended for the reconnaissance platforms," he said quietly, ensuring their conversation remained private, despite the respectful attention of nearby passengers, became standard across 3 different aircraft families. Your stress analysis equations are still used in current design protocols, and the diagnostic procedures you developed have been adapted for next-generation systems. Emily felt a strange disconnect between the woman who had crawled through aircraft systems in classified hangars and the person receiving this recognition. For years, she'd wondered if her work had mattered beyond the immediate missions, if her recommendations had been filed away and forgotten once the crisis passed. Now she was learning that her contributions had rippled forward through time in ways she'd never imagined. "There were nights," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I questioned whether I was seeing real problems or just being paranoid about systems that everyone else trusted. Senior engineers would review my reports with skepticism, questioning whether the issues I identified were significant enough to warrant mission delays or equipment modifications." "Paranoid." O'Neill's expression grew serious, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the consequences of ignored warnings. "Emily, your paranoia saved more lives than most combat operations. The mission profile changes based on your recommendations prevented losses that would have compromised national security for decades. Every pilot who returned safely from those reconnaissance missions owes their life, in part, to your refusal to accept good enough as adequate." The aircraft shuddered slightly as the landing gear extended with mechanical precision. Emily watched the ground rushing up to meet them, thinking about all the flights that had ended safely because of modifications she'd suggested to aircraft she'd never see again. problems she'd solved for pilots whose names she'd never know. She remembered the weight of responsibility during those classified briefings, when her technical assessments could determine whether missions proceeded or were postponed. The pressure had been immense, lives balanced against operational requirements. National security weighed against acceptable risk. She'd learned to trust her instincts even when they contradicted official specifications, even when senior personnel questioned her conclusions. "You mentioned a ceremony tomorrow," she said, needing to understand how this recognition fit into the larger picture of her hidden service. "The Advanced Systems Development Group is receiving a unit citation tomorrow at Miramar for classified achievements spanning the last 15 years. Your work was foundational to theirs. The diagnostic protocols you developed, the failure analysis procedures you pioneered, the safety modifications you recommended." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's time for some recognition to emerge from the shadows, even if the operational details remain protected." Emily realized her simple trip to San Diego had become something entirely different from what she'd planned. For years, she'd lived with the quiet knowledge that her work had mattered, but without external validation, that knowledge had gradually been eroded by doubt and the civilian world's inability to understand the significance of what she'd done. The challenge coin in her pocket had been her only proof of service, worn smooth by years of nervous handling, during moments when she'd questioned her own memories. The brass had been polished by countless anxious touches, a talisman that connected her to a past that sometimes felt more like vivid dreams than actual experience. "The people at tomorrow's ceremony," O'Neill continued, "understand the weight of invisible service. Many of them have worked in similar programs, faced similar challenges, made similar sacrifices. They'll recognize what your medal represents, not just technical excellence, but moral courage in environments where speaking truth to power could end careers." As the aircraft touched down with a gentle bump that spoke to the pilot's skill, Emily thought about the irony of the day's events. She'd boarded this flight as a forgotten technician, enduring public humiliation from people who'd never questioned their assumptions about who deserved respect and who didn't. The airplane rolled toward the gate, and Emily noticed how the other passengers' behavior toward her had completely transformed. Where there had been mockery and suspicion, now there were respectful nods and genuine smiles. Some passengers had approached during the flight to offer quiet words of appreciation, their earlier judgment replaced by embarrassment over their hasty conclusions. Colonel Mercer remained seated with his head down, unable to make eye contact with anyone. His earlier confidence in identifying fraud had evaporated completely, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his judgment, which he'd trusted throughout his career, had failed catastrophically when it mattered most. "General," Emily said as passengers began gathering their belongings, "why now? Why is this recognition happening after all these years of silence?" O'Neill considered her question carefully, his expression reflecting the complexity of military bureaucracy and classified operations. Several factors converged. Congressional oversight of classified programs has changed significantly. There's new understanding about the psychological impact of unacknowledged service on veterans. We've learned that people who serve invisibly often suffer disproportionately from isolation and doubt about the value of their contributions. He paused, watching other passengers prepare to disembark while maintaining their respectful distance. There's also been recognition that the classification system itself caused harm to personnel, whose only crime was excellence in sensitive positions. And frankly, some of us who benefited from your work now have enough rank and influence to ensure proper recognition happens. Regardless of bureaucratic inertia, Emily understood the unspoken message that junior officers who'd witnessed her contributions had spent years climbing the hierarchy until they possessed sufficient authority to correct past injustices. The military's emphasis on taking care of its own had finally reached back to protect someone who'd been left behind by circumstance and classification requirements. As passengers began moving down the aisle, Howard Lake approached their row with the careful gait of someone whose career had been spent around dangerous machinery. His weathered face carried the respect of someone who understood the weight of invisible service and the cost of maintaining secrets that kept others safe. "Ma'am, I worked flight lines for 30 years, he said, extending his hand to Emily with genuine warmth. "I knew something wasn't right about how you were being treated. People who've really served in the deep programs have a different way of carrying themselves, a combination of confidence and caution that comes from handling equipment that can't fail. Emily shook his hand, feeling the connection between people who'd worked in aviation's hidden corners. His calloused palm spoke of decades maintaining aircraft that kept others safe, work that required precision, dedication, and the ability to find problems others missed or ignored. "Thank you for speaking up when it mattered," she replied. "Not everyone would have bothered to get involved. We take care of our own," Lake said simply. "Even when the paperwork doesn't match the reality, even when the official records don't reflect the truth about who served and how they served, some of us remember the people who kept us safe through their dedication to getting the details right." As they moved down the aisle together, Emily noticed how other passengers made space respectfully. The flight attendant, who had initially questioned her documentation, now smiled warmly, clearly pleased by the afternoon's unexpected turn of events and her small role in facilitating justice. Captain Dunning stood as they passed, offering a genuine salute that Emily acknowledged with a nod. The gesture felt different from the mockery that had preceded it. This carried the weight of professional respect between equals, recognition of shared commitment to service despite different specialties. At the aircraft door, Emily paused to look back at the cabin where her dignity had been attacked and then restored within the span of a few hours. The experience had been painful, but it had also returned something essential to her: the knowledge that her contributions hadn't been forgotten by everyone who mattered, that truth had a way of surfacing even when buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic convenience. She stepped into the jetway carrying herself differently than when she'd boarded, shoulders back, head up, wearing the bearing of someone whose service had finally been acknowledged by those qualified to judge its worth. The transformation felt profound, as if years of accumulated doubt had been lifted from her shoulders in the space of a single flight, replaced by the quiet confidence that came from validated competence and recognized sacrifice. The San Diego evening air carried the familiar scents of ocean salt and aviation fuel as Emily and General O'Neill walked through the terminal, the sounds of military aircraft in the distance creating a soundtrack that had defined much of Emily's professional life. The familiar environment felt like returning to a world she'd been forced to leave behind, but now with the possibility of belonging again, the terminal bustled with typical Friday evening activity. Families reuniting after business trips, travelers hurrying to make connections, service members in various uniforms moving with the purposeful efficiency that characterized military personnel, transitioning between assignments. Emily observed it all with new eyes, seeing herself differently within the larger community of people who served in visible and invisible ways. She noticed details she'd trained herself to observe during her active years. The way military personnel carried themselves even in civilian clothes, the subtle signs of rank and experience in posture and movement, the unspoken communication between service members who recognized each other across crowded spaces. It was a language she'd forgotten she still spoke fluently. "Emily," O'Neill said as they reached the baggage claim area, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to share information that couldn't be discussed in more public settings. "I want to be clear about something that couldn't be said in front of the others. The work you did wasn't just technically excellent. It was courageous in ways that went beyond normal professional requirements." She looked at him questioningly, sensing there were layers to this recognition that hadn't been revealed during the flight's more public moments. "You identified problems that more senior people missed or ignored, sometimes because they didn't want to see issues that would complicate their operations or threaten their timelines. You stood by your conclusions when others doubted them, even when that stance threatened your career advancement and relationships with supervisors." Emily thought about those long nights in classified hangars, trusting her instincts against official specifications and senior engineers who questioned her findings based more on convenience than technical analysis. It had felt less like courage and more like stubborn determination to do the job correctly, regardless of political pressure or the desire to avoid complications. "There were times," Emily admitted, watching travelers navigate around them as they waited for her bag to appear, "when I wondered if I was pushing too hard, questioning systems that everyone else accepted as reliable. Some supervisors suggested I was being unnecessarily cautious, that my recommendations would cause expensive delays for problems that might never materialize. Those systems would have failed," O'Neill said firmly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Your persistence prevented catastrophic losses during operations that couldn't afford failure. The mission success rate for reconnaissance flights improved by 37% after your recommendations were implemented, and several incidents that could have compromised national security were prevented by problems you identified during routine maintenance. They collected Emily's single bag from the carousel, the same worn duffel that had traveled with her to classified installations around the world. Inside were tools that had diagnosed problems in aircraft worth billions, instruments that had helped keep pilots alive during missions that officially never happened. The bag itself was unremarkable, but it contained the physical remnants of a career that had shaped modern military aviation in ways most people would never understand. The ceremony tomorrow, O'Neill continued as they walked toward the terminal exit, passing shops and restaurants that served the endless stream of travelers connecting San Diego to the rest of the world. Will have limited attendance due to security requirements, but the people there will understand what your recognition means. Some of them worked on programs that benefited directly from your innovations. Others are current personnel, whose lives are safer because of systems you helped develop. Emily felt the weight of that responsibility. Her work hadn't ended when she'd retired. It had continued through the people who'd learned from her methods, the procedures that had been codified from her innovations, the aircraft that flew more safely because of problems she'd identified and solutions she'd developed. "There's something else I need you to know," O'Neill said as they approached the terminal's main entrance, where the evening air mixed airport climate control with the natural warmth of Southern California. "The reason your service records were classified so heavily wasn't just about operational security. It was about protecting you personally." Emily's expression sharpened, sensing that this revelation would explain years of confusion about her abrupt transition to civilian life. "What do you mean?" O'Neill looked around carefully, ensuring their conversation remained private despite the public setting. "Some of the problems you identified weren't just technical failures or normal wear patterns. They were sabotage attempts. Foreign intelligence services trying to compromise our reconnaissance capabilities through subtle modifications that would cause failures during critical missions." The revelation hit Emily like a physical blow, forcing her to process years of self-doubt and confusion through an entirely different lens. She'd always wondered why her retirement had been so abrupt, why her security clearances had been revoked so completely, why her transition to civilian life had felt more like witness protection than normal military separation. "Your diagnostic work exposed several penetration attempts that could have compromised national security for decades," O'Neill continued. "The people who wanted to silence you believed that eliminating key technical personnel would compromise our ability to detect future sabotage. Making you invisible protected both you and the programs you'd helped secure." Emily leaned against a concrete pillar near the terminal entrance, her mind reeling as she processed the implications. Her forced retirement hadn't been bureaucratic indifference or budget cuts. It had been witness protection disguised as administrative action, a way to remove her from targeting while maintaining operational security. "How many others were affected?" she asked, thinking about colleagues who had similarly disappeared from classified programs without explanation. "Enough that Congress is now investigating the entire classification and personnel protection system," O'Neill replied. "Your medal isn't just recognition for past service. It's part of a larger effort to acknowledge personnel whose service was hidden for their own protection, people whose contributions were minimized or erased to keep them safe." The pieces of her post-service life suddenly made sense. The difficulty finding employment that matched her skills, the sense that her experience was somehow tainted or suspicious, the gradual erosion of confidence as the civilian world failed to recognize her expertise. It hadn't been personal failure. It had been systematic erasure designed to protect her from enemies she'd never known she'd made. "The people who tried to compromise those programs," O'Neill explained, "were eventually identified and neutralized. But the damage to personnel like you had already been done. We're trying to correct that now, to restore recognition and dignity to people whose service was hidden for reasons beyond their control." As they prepared to part ways outside the terminal, where taxis and rideshare vehicles moved in constant circulation, O'Neill handed her a business card with minimal information, just a phone number and an address at Miramar. The simplicity was typical of military communications in sensitive situations. Enough information to accomplish the mission. Nothing extra that could compromise security. The van will collect you at your hotel at 1400 hours tomorrow. Transportation will be provided by military personnel with appropriate clearances. He paused, his expression carrying the weight of years of unspoken regret and institutional failure. And Emily, thank you for your service. It should have been said years ago, but it needed to be said properly. With full understanding of what that service cost you, she watched him walk away, his presence commanding respectful distance from other travelers even in civilian settings. Military bearing was difficult to disguise, she realized, which made the afternoon's failure to recognize hers all the more ironic and painful. Emily took her phone from her pocket and opened the camera app. She photographed the metal box against the backdrop of aircraft lights visible through the terminal windows, wanting to document this moment when her invisible service finally became visible. The image would remind her that sometimes patience was rewarded, even when hope had nearly died, even when the system that should have protected her had instead abandoned her to protect itself. Outside the terminal, she hailed a taxi and settled into the back seat with her duffel bag, giving the driver her hotel address as San Diego's lights spread below them during the drive-through evening traffic. Emily reflected on the strange justice of the day's events. She'd endured public humiliation from people who'd never made sacrifices for anything larger than their own careers, never risked their safety for abstract concepts like national security or the greater good. But truth had a way of surfacing, even when buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic convenience. Sometimes it took years. Sometimes it required the right people reaching positions of sufficient authority. But truth eventually found its way to the surface. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Hartwell, this is Howard Lake. If you ever need someone to verify your service record, you have my contact information. Some of us remember the people who kept us safe, even when the paperwork says they never existed. The aviation community takes care of its own, regardless of what the official records show. Emily smiled, realizing that while she'd lost her anonymity today, she'd gained something more valuable, a community of people who understood the weight of invisible service and the cost of protecting secrets that kept others alive. She wasn't alone anymore, wasn't the only person carrying the burden of unacknowledged sacrifice. At her hotel, she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the metal box again, studying the decoration in the room's warm lamplight. The metal was small, understated, designed to honor invisible service without revealing operational details. Perfect for people like her, who'd served in the spaces between official acknowledgement and deniable operations. The weight of the metal seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it carried not just recognition for her own service but validation for all the others who'd served similarly, whose contributions had been hidden or minimized for reasons of security or convenience. She thought about tomorrow's ceremony, wondering what it would feel like to be surrounded by people who understood the true cost of invisible service. For years, she'd carried her secrets alone, unable to share the satisfaction of problems solved or the weight of responsibilities shouldered. Tomorrow, she would be among others who knew that weight intimately. Emily pulled out her worn challenge coin and placed it beside the new medal on the hotel room's small desk. The contrast was striking. The old coin spoke of unofficial recognition among peers, while the new medal represented official acknowledgement from the highest levels of military leadership. Both were important, but together they told the complete story of her service. She opened her phone's contact list and found a number she hadn't called in years. Her sister in Phoenix, who'd stopped asking about Emily's work when it became clear that all questions would be met with vague responses about government consulting. Emily typed a simple message. I'm in San Diego for a military ceremony tomorrow. My work has finally been officially recognized. I'll call you Sunday with details I can share. The response came quickly. I never doubted you were doing something important. Proud of you, always. Emily felt tears threatening, not from sadness but from the relief of being able to acknowledge her service to family who'd supported her even when they couldn't understand what she did. The isolation of classified work extended beyond the workplace, affecting every relationship, every conversation, every attempt to explain why certain topics couldn't be discussed. She called room service and ordered dinner. Realizing she hadn't eaten since early morning, the day's emotional intensity had suppressed her appetite. But now that the immediate crisis had passed, she felt the need for normalcy, for the simple routine of a meal eaten in peace. While waiting for food to arrive, Emily unpacked her few belongings. Her tools went on the dresser, arranged with the precision that had characterized her work for decades. Each instrument had stories, problems solved, disasters prevented, lives saved through attention to details others missed. The room service cart arrived with a simple meal that felt luxurious after the day's stress. As she ate, Emily reflected on how different her life might have been if her service had been acknowledged from the beginning. If she'd been able to build a career on visible achievements rather than classified contributions. But she also recognized that the work she'd done required secrecy, that the very invisibility that had cost her personally had been necessary to protect operations that kept others safe. The contradiction was frustrating but ultimately acceptable. Some sacrifices were worth making. Even when the recognition was delayed or absent, her phone rang. Another unknown number. She answered cautiously. Ms. Hartwell, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez, protocol officer at Miramar. General O'Neill asked me to call regarding tomorrow's ceremony. Yes, Colonel. Ma'am, I wanted to confirm your transportation and brief you on the ceremony's format. The recognition will be part of a larger awards event. With your presentation occurring near the end, General O'Neill will present your medal personally, and there will be opportunity for photographs if you're comfortable with that. Emily considered the question. After years of invisibility, the idea of photographs felt strange but not unwelcome. That would be appropriate. Excellent. There will also be a reception afterward where you'll have opportunity to meet other recipients and personnel who've worked in similar programs. Many of them have expressed interest in meeting you personally. The prospect of meeting others who'd shared similar experiences excited Emily more than the formal recognition. To be among people who understood the specific challenges of classified work, who knew the weight of unacknowledged responsibility, it would be like finding a family she'd thought was lost forever. Colonel, may I ask about the other recipients? I can share that tomorrow's ceremony recognizes various forms of service in classified programs, from technical specialists like yourself to operational personnel whose missions remain protected. General O'Neill felt it was important to acknowledge the full spectrum of invisible service. After ending the call, Emily stepped onto her hotel room's small balcony, where the evening air carried the sound of aircraft operations from multiple nearby military installations. The familiar sounds were comforting. She was back in her element. Surrounded by the community that had shaped her professional identity, she thought about Colonel Mercer and the others who'd misjudged her on the flight. Their mistake had been natural. They'd judged by appearances, applied conventional wisdom about who belonged in military spaces. But their error highlighted a larger problem, with how society recognized service that didn't fit traditional narratives. Emily's phone buzzed with another message. This one from General O'Neill. Emily, tomorrow you'll meet Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, who now oversees aircraft maintenance protocols based largely on procedures you developed. He's been requesting this meeting for years. Your work lives on through people like him. The idea that her innovations continued through other professionals gave Emily a sense of continuity she'd lost during her isolated retirement years. She wasn't just receiving recognition for past service. She was being reconnected to ongoing work that had grown from her foundations. As night settled over San Diego, Emily prepared for bed with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would complete a circle that had been broken by classification requirements and security concerns. Her service would finally be acknowledged in the community where it had been performed. She placed the medal box on the nightstand, where it would be the first thing she saw in the morning. The small decoration represented more than personal recognition. It was proof that invisible service could eventually become visible. That truth could survive bureaucratic erasure. That people who served in shadows could eventually step into light. In the distance, military aircraft continued their eternal vigilance, maintained by people whose names would never appear in history books, but whose dedication kept freedom alive through patient, invisible work. Emily was part of that tradition now, officially and permanently, her service finally documented and recognized by those who understood its true value. The medal caught the hotel room's lamplight, casting reflections that danced across the ceiling like the navigation lights of aircraft she'd helped keep airborne through dark skies and dangerous missions. For the first time in years, Emily Hartwell felt completely like herself again, not a forgotten technician, but a guardian whose watch had finally been acknowledged. As she drifted toward sleep, Emily thought about the challenge coin that had been her only proof of service for so long. Tomorrow, that solitary token would be joined by official recognition, but it would always represent the years when faith in her own worth was all she had to sustain her. Sometimes patience was rewarded. Sometimes truth found its way to the surface. Sometimes invisible heroes finally received the recognition they'd earned through quiet dedication to keeping others safe. Tomorrow would be one of those times. Sometimes the greatest heroes walk among us unrecognized, their courage measured not in moments of glory but in years of quiet service that keeps others safe. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit your expectations, remember that extraordinary people often wear ordinary faces, and that true honor sometimes lives in the most unexpected places. Would you like another story?